Hello! So in this video, we're going to be going over the basics of creating your own A-frame application, including how to set up the scene, how to add some objects to it, including some custom models, as well as customizing your Skybox and orienting objects in the scene. And to get started, you'll see that we've cleared up some of the other files and code from our project here, and removed things that aren't necessarily specific for A-frame because, again, it's not exactly like making a 2D web page, so it's a little bit different. Most notably, you'll see that we've added in this script tag here, so we're actually including a number of JavaScript files that are compiled into its full release for A-frame that are hosted on A-frame's website, so we're using version 1.1 here specifically. And so to create an A-frame scene to get started, much like an HTML document has this HTML tag at the top of the entire page, to create an A-frame scene specifically, we go into the body itself, and we kind of have its own kind of master parent. And this specific tag is called A-scene. And you'll see the syntax being kind of reproduced a lot in that every A-frame tag that they've created specifically for A-frame entities has this A-name syntax to it. So we have this A-scene tag here, and this is going to serve as the parent that everything else we do for our A-frame environment is going to go inside of. So we have our A-scene here to get started with. Simple enough. And you can kind of already tell this is working. We've got our preview here still, our tab for the website. And if we refresh the page here, you'll see that it's a white environment. You'll see that you can click and drag now because you're actually in a virtual world, but it's entirely blank. It's devoid of anything of space. Then there's no lighting or anything. It's nothingness. And you can verify that it's working though, because you'll see that our console here is showing that A-frame is running. There's no errors happening so far, so that's good. And we also have this VR button here that we'll be able to enter into VR. So if you were on a device, you would actually go into VR mode now. But since we're on a desktop computer, all you see is this blackness because there's actually nothing to show. So let's go back to our scene here, and let's actually start adding things to this environment. And so A-frame comes with a variety of primitive objects and shapes out of the box. To get started, most notably, we have A-box, and we're going to add a couple properties or components to this box to get started with, just to kind of give us something to look at because there's some default values, but we're going to change them a little bit. The first thing we're going to change is the position. So we're going to set the position of it. The syntax here being that you have your HTML element here, and then you have these properties you associate with it. So we'll define the position first, the position being in XYZ coordinates. I have some predefined values here that I use just so that it kind of gets placed in the scene in a nice position and looks nice to start off with as we set up our environment. The next thing I'll set is the rotation of it, just to kind of show you. So in this case, we'll just use 0, 0, 0 for the rotation, but that is also an XYZ axis. One thing to note about this, if you're not familiar kind of often with graphics libraries, with 3D engines, X, Y, and Z, kind of contrary to what you might think, X and Y plane kind of exist in terms of the plane of the screen you're looking at. So like X is left, right, and Y is up, down. And then Z is kind of the depth into the screen, for when you start the scene at least. So when you want to raise something up and down, you use the Y axis as opposed to the Z axis, which you might think of if you kind of were doing like traditional geometry, which you normally think about. So the next property we'll change here is the color of it, and you can set the color either through there's a kind of a vocabulary of colors that they already have supported out of the box. You could like red, blue, orange, things like that. Or you could just use the hex codes for the color if you're kind of more of a designer or more interested in kind of customizing your colors. I have a couple hex codes that I've already predefined that kind of give these nice pastel colors to it. So it's a little easier on the eyes compared to what you might see if you use the standard kind of set of colors. So we have this box that we've defined, and if we go back to the scene here and refresh the page, we see that we now have a box. We have a cube. And now that we have something to reference point off of, we'll say that A-frame by default has a couple controls. So you see that we can click and drag around the scene using our mouse. And you can likewise move around the scene by using your WASD keys to kind of move forward, backward, and left and right. You can likewise just use your arrow keys. They do the same thing. So you can move around the environment, click and drag to look around to get started with. And this is, of course, only in keyboard controls. If you're in a VR headset, you can check it out. You could actually go to this URL and see this in VR with a VR headset or even with your phone. And it'll do the own gyroscope rotation. So that's another massive benefit of using WebXR is that it's all out of the box and supported for you. You don't have to think about implementing all of that. So let's add a couple more objects into our scene, a couple more entities, if you will. And we'll just kind of add in some more custom properties to them. So now I'm going to add in a sphere, which is denoted by a-sphere. Funny that. And we'll set the position for that, 0, 1.25, -3. One of the interesting properties about spheres specifically is that they have a radius component that you can set. So we'll scale it up a little bit. We'll make it 1.25 for radius as opposed to the default of 1. And then we'll add a custom color to this as well, a hex code here that I already have predefined. Again, it's, again, I've tested some color palettes out, and these are the ones that look nice to see. Not too bright, not too overwhelming. We'll also add in a cylinder, so a-cylinder, and we'll set the position for that as well. So we'll do 2, 0.75, and -2. You'll see that I'm setting all of the Z values for these at a negative because the camera by default is looking into the scene, and as you go into the scene, the Z value goes negative in direction. If you do positive Z, it would start behind the camera. That gets initialized. And so with a cylinder, we can set the radius, and we can also set the height of a cylinder specifically. So we'll shrink the radius a bit, and we'll increase the height a bit, so we get more of a kind of a tube shape. And we have kind of our predefined color here that I'll use for this one as well. And finish that up. And so if we come back to our scene and we refresh it, we will see our spread of different shapes here now that we're looking at, including our sphere and our cylinders with kind of these colors. You can feel free to use whatever colors you want for this, whatever dimensions you want, as long as you kind of have these basic shapes in your own scene. If you're following along, then you can still do all of the follow-up kind of scripting we're going to do for these objects, but we will be using these objects for some examples later on, so if you're following along, please add these in as well. And so you've noticed that we have this scene, and we have this blank white space around us with some objects just kind of floating in the ether. And so one of the things you'll kind of find you very quickly want to have is like a floor. You want some type of reference point when you're in VR, some type of ground, right? You want to feel like you're standing on something. And so the next thing we're going to add in is a plane. Not like an airplane, but like a plane, like a flat plane. And so we'll set the position of this. We won't get quite as creative with the positioning of it, but we're going to set it at a Z distance of -4 away. And we'll see why in a second. And planes by default are oriented to be upwards, kind of like a wall. So we're going to actually rotate this by -90 degrees. So that's flat on the ground, and then we'll keep the rotation of the other two directions 0 here. And with a plane, the other things we're going to change is we could set a width and a height associated with it. So we're going to set the width to 8, and we're also going to set the height to 8. And then last, we're going to set the color again. And so we're setting all of these things right, and you're seeing that I'm setting all these properties. And kind of going back to the first video in the series, what we're actually doing is we're setting components. These are kind of the basic components or properties of these entities, but these are all actually just entities that have some amount of previous support as primitive shapes in A-frame. And so they're realistically just empty objects with a couple components already defined, like a geometry component and a mesh component already specified associated with them. And so it just makes it that much easier to kind of get started adding these primitive shapes in. But we'll see in a moment what it looks like to actually add in an empty object and add our own shapes to it. But so we have this plane defined, and we can come back to our scene here and refresh it again. And now we've got a plane. We've got a floor. We have something to stand on. If you come into a VR now it feels like you're actually standing on something. We still have this white ether around us. We really have any concept of what's beyond this, the entirety of our universe, which is this plane and these shapes on the ground. So let's add in what is called a skybox, if you're not familiar with that term. So a skybox is in 3D environments and 3D engines. It's basically what you can have as the background to the world. It could be a flat color, or it could be like an image or some sort. So let's start off. We'll show in A-frame, you can define a-sky, which will set the skybox in the environment. And if you want to see one example, we could just do like some shade of gray as our skybox to start off with. And when we refresh it here, we'll see that it's turned a slightly different shade of gray. If we were to get really kind of disgusting about it, we could set it to some kind of background color and refresh it, and now the whole world is blue. But let's say instead of having a color, let's say instead you wanted to have like an image, you had like a 360 photosphere that you had taken somewhere. And so what you can do instead of setting the color here is you could set the source. So in that case, it's src. And you can have either, you could upload an image to the assets folder and actually directly link to it. We'll see kind of what that looks like later on. But you can also just grab any image available on the internet that has cross-origin research sharing enabled. I won't go too far into that, but if you're interested in that thing, look up CORS policy, CORS, to learn a little bit more about that. But I'll grab this image that I already had a link to available here from Wikimedia Commons. Credit to Maximilian Schonher, the photographer of this 360 image. But now if we change the source to this as our 360 image and we refresh the page here, give it a second because it has to actually load the image from an external website. But once it's loaded, we'll see that we now have this 360 photosphere from drone footage of the Azores off the coast of Portugal as our 360 photosphere around us. So we have kind of a nice background now to our originally limited world of just this floating plane. Now we're still a floating plane, but we're actually grounded in the world somewhere. And you can change it to other 360 images. You could actually use 360 videos even as a background if you wanted to for the sky, to make it kind of like if you had 360 footage of like driving in a car, you could actually make it feel like you're sitting in a car moving just by doing that 360 footage. But for the time being, we'll just use this background image. And so the last thing we'll cover in this part of the video, as I mentioned, is we've seen some primitive shapes and we've seen a skybox. But what if you want to use like a custom shape, a custom model, if you had like a mesh of some kind? And to do that, as we saw, it took a second for that image to load. And so A-frame actually comes with an asset management system associated with it. And to use that, we can actually go into our code here on our HTML, and we can define an a-assets tag. And this, inside this tag, is how the asset management system is done. And so what this does for us is that A-frame can preload these assets, these models or images or videos before the application starts, such that you don't see the application stutter and freeze as it tries to load something from another website in real time. And so once you have this a-assets tag, within it, you can specify different assets you want to add. So in this case, we'll do a-asset-item. And for these assets, what you want to do is specify an ID associated with them. And so for this ID, we will give it, we'll call it a chair model. Spoilers for what's about to come next. And then we'll specify a source, like we saw with the image. But in this case, what I actually have is a 3D model that I've uploaded to a prior glitch project, and I actually have a link to it from here. So I can specify the link to this model. Likewise, if you could find a link to another 3D model somewhere else hosted online, you could link that as well. And we can close that tag. And now we have this model that's getting preloaded in our asset management system here. And then in our actual A-frame code, what we can do is instead of defining a primitive, we'll use the generic entity tag. Kind of coming back to this entity component system idea, we have this a-entity. And so we'll define a position for it. We'll set it as 0, 1.5, -1. And in this case, the actual model that I have here is called a GLTF. It's a relatively new file format for 3D models, but it's a way of having both a 3D mesh as well as the actual textures, the outside physical properties of it, the visual properties of it, all packaged into one model together. It's just one way of storing all this information. but it's one of the better ways that's supported online. So we'll have a GLTF model here as the component we're setting. And then what we'll pass in here is actually a hashtag followed by the ID that we are referencing for the asset we're trying to get. And we'll close that. And now we have this GLTF model. And if we come back to our page and refresh it again, we'll see that our model, it seems to have loaded in faster. You might have seen that it was a blue screen at the start, and that's because that's what A-Frame's asset management system does, is that before it starts the application, it actually tries to load all these assets in first, so that when the application starts, the assets can be dropped in instantly. So you saw the chair come in a lot faster than you saw the image get loaded in. But now we have this custom chair model. This is actually a 3D scan of one of the chairs in our own lab space that we're looking at here. But we have custom models integrated into our A-Frame application here. And it works just like every other entity. It has its own position and rotation that you can change, and this own this mesh that we're looking at here. So this has been the first step in the long journey of making your own A-Frame application. But as you can see, in the span of a couple minutes, we've already put together an entire 3D environment. We have objects in it. We have a skybox around us. You know, you could, with just these tools alone, go out and make an entire 3D virtual environment and have people just kind of tour around it. You could just make like a 3D art museum or an art gallery. And we're just going to improve from here. The next thing we're going to talk about is interactions and actually interacting with a 3D scene. And that'll come up in the next video. So go check it out.